Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for my effectively this is going to be a one-turn demonstration mini playthrough of Victory in the Pacific, just to give those of you who have never come across this marvelous game before a chance to see what it is like in action, how the turn steps work, how combat works, and hopefully to give you a sense of the strategic considerations that govern your play of this game. I say that with due trepidation and dread because I freely acknowledge to not being the greatest strategist out there. So take it in the sense of, look, this is how the game works, but please don't take any of this as serious strategic advice. I'm very conscious from some of the marvelous comments my last video has got. Thank you guys very much. I will reply and acknowledge as soon as I can. But just to say that for those of you who know this game extremely well, I expect who may even know it better than I do, I hope this is a very, very pleasant walk down memory lane for you. And I really look forward to putting this on. Just a word of warning. My chief strategist, Oscar the Cat, is in the vicinity, so you may occasionally hear from him as he decides to add commentary or, better yet, move his bulk across the board. So just be aware that he is out there, lurking like a malevolent eye boat, just waiting for an opportunity. So anyway, without further ado, um, this is the game in progress. I haven't done the starting setup, so if any of you are wondering why the Japanese have already cut a swathe through the Southern Resources area, it's because I'm actually halfway through the game. Now, my reason for starting us partway through is because, like many strategic Pacific War games, Victory in the Pacific uses a very clever mechanism for simulating the initial Japanese surprise attack, not just at Pearl Harbor, but throughout the region. And while this is very elegantly executed in this game, they do it through the medium of just permitting doubled attacks with no return fire, essentially, in the affected areas. It doesn't really make for great viewing because you've got the Japanese player on the one hand thumping the Allied player, hoping that he'll fall over from exhaustion and the number of hits he's taking. And on the other side, you've got the Allied player absorbing all these hits and hoping the Japanese player will collapse from sheer exhaustion from hitting him so much. Um, Yep, turn one is not great for the well-being of the allied player. And actually, if the dice don't favor you, it can't be all that great for the well-being of the Japanese player either. I have played some rather horrible games where my brilliant attack on Pearl Harbor rolled a whole slew of ones, which was embarrassing. But anyway, so that is the main reason I've decided to start midway through the war. So what I'm actually playing is turn four. And the reason I've picked turn four is because in terms of the date range, this covers the period from about September, October 1942 up to January 1943. So it's a fairly pivotal few months in the war. You know, the big carrier battles of 1942 have largely been fought, unless you want to throw a Santa Cruz in this turn. And so attrition has taken a fairly steady toll over on all of the fleets concerned. In fact, I just so happily have my camera angled in the right place. You can see the casualty pile on to the right, and you can see that it has not taken long, even though the aggregate Allied casualties are higher than the Imperial navies. The IJN has suffered more casualties individually than the other fleets. And while the Dutch have been pretty much knocked out of the war, the Eastern Fleet, the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet, as we'll see in a moment, has actually done better than it has any right to do. So it's a wonderful tipping point. And just to make clear for those of you who don't know this game, there is only one scenario. There is the whole war from start to finish with an optional ninth turn if the Japanese player's feeling a bit of a masochist. So there isn't actually a setup as such. There are a few fan-made ones, but as far as the game concerns, there is concerned, sorry, there's no setup that lets you kick off in late 42 or early 43. So what I did to get us here was I set up the game and I initially made historical moves for both sides with every intention of adapting my strategy depending on what happened. So, as you would expect, there were some enormous carrier battles as both sides chucked in everything they could, trying to gain an advantage before certainly for as the Japanese, before the Allied land-based air begins to really build up. And the casualties have been absolutely horrific. So now's probably a good time for me to get into a bit of a strategic overview, just so that you know what the situation is. So the all-important points of control track, the Japanese are leading by a crucial 4 points. And I say crucial because early in the game, I did quite well playing for the Japanese, and we had a healthy lead in points of control. In fact, I was even putting feelers down into the Coral Sea, down that away, earlier than the Japanese managed historically. So it was all looking really good. But then the Allies bounced back and started making the Japanese work for it. And so their lead is still very real, but has been eroded. So moving from west to east across the map, the Japanese are a bit stalemated with the British in the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal, mainly because both sides have suffered significant carrier losses. The British have lost one of their fleet carriers, which doesn't sound like a lot in the context of this game, but for Eastern Fleet, every carrier is precious, and their carriers, they are quite weak in this game, certainly in terms of their offensive capability. The Japanese were fighting the British with the strategy of committing all their heavy carriers over here against the USA, and treating the Commonwealth somewhat contemptuously by just forming a special task force with all their light carriers, ships like Ryujo, Shoho, Zuiho. And initially, that strategy paid off until the British managed to surprise them in the Bay of Bengal and sank every carrier except for poor little who is that? Poor little Ryujo over there. So all of a sudden, Japanese carrier strength in that region is at a bit of a nadir. Now, if they move offensively again into either the Indian Ocean or the Bay of Bengal, they run into the significant problem that the Royal Navy not only equals them, if not slightly exceeds them in carrier hitting power, but the Allies can place land-based air and the Japanese don't have that luxury. So they're going to have to be a tiny bit more circumspect about, messing around over there. Their hold on the Central Pacific was generally very good. However, their advance is bogging down. There have been two battles of Midway to date, neither of which has gone Japan's way, although the US Navy paid extremely heavily on both occasions for those victories. Down in the south, where the Japanese were pinning a lot of their hopes, things have been going a bit sour. So Guadalcanal has changed hands once each for both sides. And the Japanese, after making a bit of an inroad into the Coral Sea, have now been pushed back. And they're right back where they started, in effect. They need to snuff out Guadalcanal as a prelude to moving into the Coral Sea. But just to make their lives very, very difficult, while they were trying to pursue this, the US gambled on a very risky move, and this is the real Operation Shoestring, not that diversion down there. They managed to fight some Marines through and managed to seize the base of Malulap. Now, this isn't as great as it sounds because the Japanese still control the surrounding area. So the US is now committed to a fight if they want to keep that base in enemy-dominated waters. But the good news is, as long as they keep that toehold, they can now deploy land-based air to fighting in the Marshalls, which of course is a serious problem for the Japanese. They don't they don't want the US to have that leverage down there. So they're going to be doing their best to try and prize them out of it. And this leads to the big problem. As you can see from all these stacks of counters around the map, the Japanese have quite a few ships, but the problem they have in the Indian Ocean is mirrored throughout the empire. They simply do not have any carriers. Just to give you an idea of sorry, how bad the situation is, up there, the only fleet carrier, the only survivor of the original Kido Butai is Akagi. And the reason she's in the home islands is because she's only just recovered her damage from the terrible thrashing she took at the Second Battle of Midway Island. Down in Truk Lagoon, the entirety of the surviving Japanese carriers is centered around plucky little Hio over here, who's basically holding the line in the South Pacific all on her own. She has plenty of backup, and the Japanese have done very well in terms of preserving their land base there. But they are pretty much being forced onto the defensive. I would say they probably have enough carrier strength for maybe one more good fight, but they're going to have to be very careful about how they place it. Turning the board around, looking at the Allied situation, the the British over there are in a very strong position in the Indian Ocean. But they face a similar problem to the Japanese in that raiding into Indonesia could be risky, or even worse, trying to control it. Because if they make a big enough show of it, the Japanese might be tempted to fling a whole load of land-based air in there and ruin the Commonwealth's party fairly quickly. Down in the South Pacific, they have a lot of strength to match the Japanese surface strength. But the problem is they have absolutely zero aircraft carriers in the South Pacific area. Some of their losses were taken down there, but is partly a deliberate weakness because they were focusing so much on battles in the Central Pacific. Now, like the Japanese, the United States Navy is presently the owner of only 2 fleet carriers, which is a little bit problematic. Both of them are at Pearl. So they still have the Yorktown and the Saratoga, but that is it. Every other US Navy ship is a surface ship of one stripe or another. So they're not outmatched by the Japanese, but if they slip up, it could tip the scales rather badly. Oh dear, my camera's just lost its focus. Come on, camera, you can do it. Sorry, guys. Let me try and get this thing back, because otherwise this could end my video very quickly. You done it? You've done it. Well done. Well done, technology. So anyway, that's a fairly lengthy strategic overview, and it's taking up very good gaming time. So onward to the game. So the turn structure in Victory in the Pacific is a little bit on the involved side. And I actually, because I have a terrible memory and can't be bothered to keep reading rule books again and again, a couple of years ago, I actually scribbled myself that just to remind me what all the steps were. But I won't keep waving that in front of your faces. I will just prop it up somewhere where I can see it. So the first thing that happens, I'll call it a deployment phase, even though it's not called that in the rule book. Beginning with the Japanese, patrolling ships are moved to sea. Now, if you remember from my previous video, patrolling ships are all about area control and maintaining your supremacy, or at least superiority in an area. That is your patrolling side as opposed to your raiding side. Now, patrolling is important because in this game you have to have ships on patrol to maintain your control of sea areas and thereby win points. And you have to have at least one, and it's not a good idea to leave weak points because that can make things go wrong. So I think starting in the Japanese home islands as a safe bet, we might as well give the main battle fleet, the Hashirajima fleet, as it's affectionately known by me and indeed by a lot of others, is going to go to sea to patrol the area around the Japanese home islands. Now, the other question is, what should I do with the cruisers? I do want to make the allies uncomfortable, but I also want to deploy my ships in a place where they'll do some good. One of the really great features of this game, another great feature that it introduced into this style of wargaming, is the variable victory points in each region. So it's very tempting for the Japanese to try another offensive into the Aleutian Islands and the North Pacific, but they have to balance it against the fact that the Japanese don't actually gain any victory points for holding or even taking the Aleutians. And it's risky because, again, they don't have the ability to project air power. And you can try and force a night action, but it's dodgy. It's very dodgy. So the question the Japanese have to ask themselves is, can they gain anything by doing that? And the answer, unfortunately, may be no. On the other hand, do they want to worry the Allies a little bit? And if so, where do they want to worry them? I think at the moment, the big Japanese concern is probably going to have to be re-securing the Marshall Islands, but they don't want to push everything there because otherwise that just telegraphs their move to the US in a very obvious way. So maybe some sort of distraction is needed. Now, because they do get a victory point for seizing control of the Central Pacific Ocean, it may be worth, and I could live to regret this, it may be worth committing brave old Akagi one last time. Her crew must be getting so sick of this patch of ocean. It's where most of her squadron mates came to grief too. So that task force is going to leave the home islands and move. Now, movement is each sea zone, so leaving Japan, it's 1 and then 2. This is going to be important for doing the speed rolls in a minute. And just because it might be fun to do so, and just in case they get a night action out of this, although she's a bit of a slow battleship, I'm going to send the Nagato with them. She's definitely going to have to make a speed roll check. So we've got our patrol forces in the Japanese islands. We've got the Central Pacific Ocean Task Force, whose objectives are still somewhat unclear, other than making poor Midway feel isolated. What are we going to do in the Indian Ocean? Are we going to do anything in the Indian Ocean? I'm going to say yes. There is quite a bit of power on both sides there. But if the oh, sorry, you couldn't even see where I was pointing. Let me tweak the camera around a bit. So, consideration for the Japanese. If they move into the Bay of Bengal, there is a very, very powerful fleet there, at least to their eyes. Just look at that big stack of ships. Also, there's unfriendly bases that can offer land-based air. So do they want to go in there? That's a very difficult question indeed. What would be nice is if they could separate some of those carriers from their accompanying battleships in a fairly low-risk way. Because the other thing I'd really like the Japanese to be able to do on this turn is to not only cause trouble here to distract the Allies, but we need to also keep an eye on Indonesia. So I'm going to take a very big risk, and I'm going to entrust the security of this entire region, because you can do that in this game, to the torpedo cruisers Kitakami and Oi. And I will chuck a raid. Where can I cause? I will chuck a raid into the Indian Ocean. Now, it is still risky, because the forces in Australia. Now, I keep saying chuck a raid into these places. I'm sorry. What I mean is I'm going to send patrolling vessels because I want to present the Allies with a very real, scary looking threat that I'm going to take some points off them this turn. Now, the Indian Ocean doesn't give the Allies any points, but it does give Japan 2. So the Allies are going to have to respond to that. What I'm hoping is that only weak forces will be able to respond from the direction of Ceylon. And the Allies will be presented with a very awkward choice of, having to weaken the forces in the South Pacific to come and deal with me. It just takes the heat off this theatre a bit. Because what I'm going to do after that is I am going to... all hinges on what I want to do with those infantry there. I think at the moment I want to get the people in the Marshall Islands. Also, I've just realized I have made an absolutely horrifically terrible mistake. Do you know what I've forgotten to do, veteran players? Anyone want to remind me? You're probably reminding me out loud, but I'm going to tell you what I forgot to do. I forgot to add in my reinforcements at the start of the turn. Now, so sorry, guys. For the Japanese, this just consists of a pitiful ground unit, which starts at Yokosuka. For the Allies, it's slightly more significant. So the United States gains at Pearl Harbor the carrier Wasp, which does beef their carrier strength up somewhat. They also get a trio of very handsome battleships, which I am sure they will be putting to excellent use in the near future. Additionally, the Allies also gain 3 land-based air units, 2 brand new reinforcements and 1 returning replacements for previous losses. At Ceylon, the British gain 2 cruisers, but unfortunately, they have to give up their 2 fleet carriers. I think events in Europe are starting to take a hand. So, okay, the balance of power with Eastern Fleet has changed significantly, but I'm not going to alter my strategy because I do want to pull the Allies in 2 directions down here. Also, thanks to my memory finally kicking in, it's a bit clearer now that the Japanese do have additional troops that they can use for other things. So, okay. So the question for the Japanese down here is the Marine unit at Truk going to end up invading the Marshalls, or are they going to try and take Guadalcanal? Now, this is a very tough choice. The Japanese do control the South Pacific, so they're getting points. But continued Allied possession of Guadalcanal is frankly a pain in the bum, and it needs to be pinched out. The Marshalls are of less value to the Japanese and could probably be dealt with another time. Although equally, they don't want to lose control of that area. This is where the tough call lies. So, cunning plan. The Japanese are going to move cruiser force into the South Pacific. Actually, no, let's not take the risk. We don't need to lose more ships. So cruiser force will move into the South Pacific. Those 2 cruisers will put to sea into the Marshalls, and they will be reinforced by Yamato for some heavy punch. In fact, actually, let's give them Mutsu as well. The fast battleships can come down here, and Hio. Now what to do? I was going to keep the two Japanese fleet carriers operating separately, but the arrival of Wasp changes everything. And I think a sensible move would be to send Hio up that way. Even if she ends up raiding rather than doing area control, it at least gives the Japanese a decent carrier force off Midway. So the next thing that happens, now that the Japanese have moved all their patrolling ships to sea, is they conduct repairs. Now, at the moment, they have no damaged ships in Yokosuka Navy Yard. So if they did, they would ordinarily be able to remove 6 points of damage, because that's how many repair points Yokosuka generates. As no one's in there, nothing happens. And the next thing I do is to flip my raiding ships over. So we've moved our patrollers out. And if you're wondering why I didn't move the units in the Philippines, is because I want them to be my fast reaction force. They're not all that great, lacking carriers. In fact, now that I think of it, if I had half a brain, I would have actually kept the light carrier Ryujo as part of the rapid reaction force. I know she's not up to much, but it might have been better to use her reactively. Never mind, lesson learned. I was being a bit too confident and silly there. But no matter, there is a force of, medium and heavy ships standing by to reinforce where necessary. So I did warn you guys at the beginning there'd be some really suboptimal moves here. So I flipped my raiding ships over for the Japanese. Now we have to make sure that our patrolling ships have actually been able to stay on station, as it were. So again, going from west to east. Now looking at the units in the Indian Ocean, the cruisers don't need to do a speed roll because you roll a dice for each ship. For every second area a patrolling ship moves into, they have to check against their speed, but you only roll one 6-sided dice per ship. So the upshot is the cruisers always pass, especially if they've got a speed like that. Ryujo, however, only has a speed of 5. So I've got to check against the speed roll. And if I get a 5 or lower, then she has to be flipped to her raiding side and can't do area control. And I get a 2. Ryujo is absolutely fine. That's a relief. No need to check for them. They only moved 1 space. I do have to check for some ships in the Midway Strike Force. I will do Hio first, and she manages to stay on her patrol side. I'll do Nagato next. She manages to stay on her patrol side. Now checking for Yamato. Oh no, she only moved 1 space. She's fine. So, yep, all the Japanese patrollers are fine. So now we move to the Allies, because they get to do all their patrolling and so forth. Well, the Japanese have very helpfully telegraphed their moves, so it's now up to the Allies to decide how they're going to respond. Now, Eastern Fleet, with the loss of the carriers, is suddenly in a somewhat more precarious position. And they have some very difficult choices to make. Now, they don't want to leave that area uncontested, and they know that they can count on land-based aircraft. So what they're going to do is they're going to move their patrol. The Eastern Fleet's cruisers are going to make a move down there. And just to give them a bit of exercise, Eastern Fleet's battleships can put out into the Bay of Bengal. Now, over here, the US has quite an impressive concentration of power. They are going to send from Australia the old battleships Oklahoma and Pennsylvania into the Indian Ocean to reinforce the British. That tips the scales very nicely against the Japanese. And over this side, they're going to entrust the defense of the Coral Sea to the Australians, and they're going to spearhead their own offensive in support of Guadalcanal with the battleship New Mexico and a host of cruisers. Now, yes, this is a weaker force, and they do run the risk that the New Mexico will have to turn away, but they're also counting on being able to place their land base there and make a nuisance of themselves. Furthermore, they won't be operating totally alone. The US is going to place a couple of cruisers in the Mandates on patrol, while another two cruisers add their strength to the forces here. So that's actually looking very healthy, assuming the Allies make it. What shall we do elsewhere? Looking to the North Pacific, the US wants to just maintain a presence up here. Now, they have a pretty shrewd idea, thanks to the Japanese committing everyone on patrol missions, that they're not going to have anything to worry about. I've made a mistake on the Japanese side. I will rectify it later. So the US are moving their cruisers into patrol positions there. In the Hawaiian Islands, they're also going to spare a couple of cruisers for patrol, but everyone else is going to be given an offensive mission. So to fight the third Battle of Midway Island, they're going to commit a pair of cruisers, every aircraft carrier they've got, because they know, thanks to US intel, that the Japanese have committed the entirety of their surviving carrier force, so they will do likewise. And they will commit their brand new battleships, plus an old one or two, to contesting the Japanese move into the Marshall Islands. So there we go. It's time for some speed rolls for the Allies. Or is it? Oh, wait, repairs. Repairs. Don't get ahead of yourself, boy. Do some repairing. Do something useful. So the only areas where the Allies have damaged ships is over in Pearl, where some of these poor fellows are actually survivors of the original attack. Now, there's an air unit here that has damage from previous attacks, so they're going to repair that. Definitely want that back. The rest of these are very heavily damaged battleships. After repairing the air units, I just want to remind myself which is the most powerful battleship here, because that's the one we're going to prioritize. And it looks like, yeah, you guys are all the survivors of Battleship Row who are still taking a bit of a mud bath. Okay, so with 4 repair points remaining, they're going to prioritize fixing the North Carolina, which suffered quite terribly in the second Battle of Midway Island. So she is now well on her way to recovery, but not quite ready for sea yet. And lastly, flipping things to their raiding side, the only ship that's going to be a raider, somewhat... Actually, do we want to risk poor Hermes? No, I think we'll just keep Hermes in port, actually, because she's a bit too precious now that the fleet carriers have gone. We have got land-based air to back up the battleships if we need it. So no raiders from the Allies this turn. And now we'll just do our speed rolls. So no need for them to check their speed rolls because they only moved one sea zone. Just as well, really. The poor old British battleships are really quite slow. We do have to do... Oh, no, we don't, because Australia straddles both these sea zones. So the two US battleships happily come out of Australia to join the Allies. Here in the South Pacific, it's a little more problematic because we have some slow battleships trying to chug their way into the combat zone. And actually, to be honest, I will be amazed if any of them make it. So I'll do the speed rolls for the New Mexico and the Mississippi first. They both fail. So what that means is they can still participate in the action, but they won't be exercising any sea control because they are now just raiding because of fuel shortages. What about the Colorado? No, she does no better. So yeah, the battleships have rather short legs, unfortunately. So moving into the Marshalls, actually all of the US battleships are a bit of a worry. I'll do the terrible twins, Indiana and South Dakota. Oh, they're fine. They're definitely patrolling. What about Idaho? It's going to be a short stay for her. And lastly, Washington. Washington manages it. Go Washington. All the other deployed US ships are well able to manage it, except possibly Wasp, which needs to not roll a 6. Yep, she is fine. So there we go. Now comes the next phase, which is the placement of land-based air. And the Japanese go first, starting both sides off alternating. Now, I'd mentioned I'd made a mistake with the Japanese deployments, and so I had. I'd completely neglected to put a patrol unit in the Marianas, which, make a silly mistake. That would cause a loss of control at the end of the turn. But luckily for the Japanese, they have a saving grace in that land-based air is able to count as a patrolling unit. So the Marianas area has been secured, although that does mean a precious air flotilla is being slightly wasted by not being in a combat zone. Bad Andrew. So the Japanese have placed theirs. The Allies are going to hold fire a bit for the moment because they want to see how things develop. But they're certainly going to place an air flotilla in the in the Indian Ocean to make life uncomfortable for the Japanese. If they can sink their last light carrier, that would be a massive bonus. The Japanese are most certainly going to place another air unit in the South Pacific. Now, placement of air units, for those of you who don't know this game, depends on you having a land base that touches the sea zone. So the Japanese couldn't place aircraft down in the US mandates or the Coral Sea unless they controlled Guadalcanal or one of the other bases first. So that, in a way, straitjackets their decisions. The Allies, unsurprisingly, are going to match the Japanese deployment down there. The Japanese are also definitely going to provide aerial reinforcements for the Marshalls, and the Allies will again follow suit. What are they going to do next? Looking at the relative value of all these territories, the Japanese would be silly not to pour more air units into the South Pacific, so that's what they'll do. The Allies will happily follow. One more in the Marshalls, I think. Again, the Allies will match. And finally, the Japanese will commit the last of their available air strength to the Solomons. Again, the Allies will match. However, the Allies have one more air unit they can place, and just to rub it in a bit, they're going to make sure that Midway Island has some decent air forces. Following that, amphibious units go to sea. So for the Japanese, they've decided, after much umming and ahhing, that they're going to slowly strangle the Marshalls, and the Kure Marine unit is going to go out into the South Pacific in order to grab Guadalcanal. In the meantime, the one from Sasebo is going to use its two-step movement and steam down there just to keep the Allies guessing. They've got their protective air umbrella, so they're fine. These guys can only move as if they're patrolling ships, 2 sea zones, but they don't need to make speed rolls. What about the US? The US, realizing that there's a serious threat down in the South Pacific, is going to move their Marine unit, their only precious Marine unit at the moment, from the US mandates into the Coral Sea. Now, the reason they've done that is that it's safe from Japanese attack, but if the Japanese do land on Guadalcanal, then the Marines will be placed to basically undo all of their good or bad work. So, and the very last thing is raiding ships put to sea. The Japanese are going to distribute their forces evenly among the various combat zones that are most important to them. They're going to leave it at that. So we now have everything deployed except for the submarine. The Japanese have the submarine unit, which is an advantage they hold for most of the game. They're going to commit that to the Battle of Midway, so most of their sub-squadrons are heading in that direction. So the pieces have moved, and the very next thing that's going to happen is going to be a whole lot of combat. But this has been a rather long video, so I'm going to leave you guys on tenterhooks now that all the deployments are finished. And I will come back to the game with the next recording, which will have lots of battle and mayhem and other craziness. But for the moment, all it remains for me to say is thank you guys so much for sticking with me on this one. I've really enjoyed your company. It's really, really great. Thank you so much. Keep those comments coming. I'll answer as soon as I can. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Take care. Bye.